Well, welcome back to our conversation on Russell Kirk's The American Cause. My name is Mike Terry. I am the superintendent of Founders Classical Academies, and I'm here with Jason Karos, our associate superintendent for academics and founding headmaster over at our Founders campus at Louisville. So we probably should just jump right into this, but I think that it'd be good to do a quick review. We're talking about Russell Kirk's book. This is a primer connected to larger works like Roots of the American Order.
Yeah.
And in it, he is establishing this argument that in order for a country to be free and to thrive, it's got to address three major bodies of principles. And in our last conversation, we talked about moral principles. We can review that in just a minute. But the other two are political principles that have to be in place, covering things like justice and injustice, freedom and tyranny, personal rights, power, and how to live peaceably together. The third area is economic, which relates to wealth and property, public and private responsibilities that we all have, and the distribution of goods and services. And today we're going to talk about the second one, the category of political things. And that it's important for us to always go forward, not on the basis of some party interest, but on the basis of principle. That there needs to be ideas that gird us up and that we are resting upon in order to make the decisions about how to move forward in our society. And so that's where we're going to start today, Jason.
That sounds great.
Okay, so we're going to be primarily focused, if you happen to pick up a copy of The American Cause, which I recommend, on the chapters 5 and 6, where he discusses the two key principles. And the first one of those is ordered liberty. But before we go there, is there anything that you feel like we should cover to set up this conversation today?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, one of the things that we talked about previously is the importance of culture. And so just making sure that we remember that none of the things that we're going to be discussing here comes out of a vacuum. Everything is tied to very long established principles and practices that are rooted in something very old, right? And so, when the founders were constructing our Declaration of Independence and later on the Constitution, they weren't creating something from scratch. They weren't trying to do something brand new and revolutionary. They were building upon things that have come before them, and so I think that'd be the only precursor comment to make at this point. Yeah.
I think that's a good observation. Is one of the things Kirk talks about is how our founders were not concerned with utopia. They weren't trying to establish the ideal civilization.
Right.
They were trying to build something that was practical, that they could all live in, and in the unique relationship that we had in the colonies,
Yes.
between the colonies, how were they even going to live together just as fellow countrymen?
Yes.
With different interests?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And thinking about the word utopia, we may have discussed this last time, but the Greek root of that means no place. And so when thinking about Plato, who wrote the first utopian book in some regards, Republic, the founders rejected those kinds of ideas related to government, and what they accepted more was what Aristotle wrote about government, which was certainly more practical and realistic. And I know we're going to delve into some of those things here today.
Well, I can tell you, as my son read The Republic a year or so ago, he came back to me and he said, "Dad, they seem like they want to control this ideal state, and I don't think I want to live in it. I don't want them telling me how I'm supposed to live." And he was onto something. He was seeing a distinction in this utopic vision that Plato presents, and began thinking more about, well, what's practical, what's the scenario in which I'm going to thrive? What do I want somebody leaning over my shoulder telling me how I'm supposed to be? Or am I going to be kind of the captain of my own ship, in a certain sense? And Russell Kirk talks about that a little bit. So you love history, and you spend a lot of time reading about history, and not that I don't love it as well, but your passion for it certainly exceeds mine. In your view, what did the framers have in mind? You sort of just alluded to it, but what did the framers have in mind with the new American states? that gets to the principles, the political principles that Russell Kirk's talking about, and also captures kind of his imagination to a certain extent.
Right, right. Well, the first chapter that we're discussing here is called Ordered Liberty. And, this is something, again, that connects back to ancient political ideals from both Greece and Rome. And, they knew that in order to have any type of freedom that meant anything, that they had to help to form a society that was well ordered, right? That didn't involve license, right? But that had some structure and some realistic expectations, because even though they had some different ideas, some of them about human anthropology and theology, they all pretty much understood that humans are highly imperfect, with a capacity to do very good, but highly imperfect and need boundaries, right? And so, in order to establish any kind of republic like they wanted to make sure to underscore the fact that without order there is no liberty. So that would be one of those things. But maybe we could just expand that a little and talk about some of the frameworks. And we were having a conversation earlier about how the founders didn't specifically look to the Greek model. When putting together their federal republic, they looked more to the Roman model. But without getting into all the details there, that's true in one way, but usually when people think about ancient Greece, they think about Athens specifically. Right. I mean, that was in many ways, the greatest city-state, certainly in terms of cultural contributions. And it's true that the founders certainly rejected the democratic ideal that the Athenians had, which was very much a type of direct democracy. But they did like other Greek models, specifically the Spartan model. And the Spartan model is a lot like the Roman model. In fact, the Romans got much of their model from the original Spartan system, which, just to lay out a couple principles there, those were built on the idea that you needed to have what's called a mixed regime. That is, to what we might today think about as like separation of powers. Mm-hmm. Right there, there's an element of sort of monarchy or single rule. There's an element of aristocracy, rule by the best, which is going to be, a small number of people, and then a what's called a polity, or a more popular body of government, which is the more democratic element, all combined into one system with what we would call types of checks and balances, today. And so, like that idea, was seen both in ancient Greece and different city-states, and in Rome, to be sure, and then later republics in the West, picked that up. And of course, that's what the American model is, built upon, basically. Now, all of that also entails a lot of underlying principles, precursor principles about human beings, about what government ought to be, how it ought to serve people, like what is the purpose of government ultimately.
So just having come out of an election, and we could talk at length, and plenty of people are, about the implications of a presidential election. There's especially the last few years, there's been talk about direct democracy or the popular election. Did they see something of that in Athens? Was there something there related to this direct model that bothered them?
Yes. Yeah. So one of the things you'll notice if you read the works of the founders when they're talking about republic, the type of regime that we had, is they don't use the word democracy. They don't like the word democracy because, just like the ancient philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, that word had a negative connotation. And the connotation came from the fact that by the time people like Socrates and Plato were living, Athens had become a direct democracy. In other words, all of the citizens not only could but had to participate, and in their main legislative body had an equal say, right? And so that's different than a representative style of government, a republic, which is what the founders created here, where you have individuals obviously representing others in their communities, and those individuals are supposed to be among the best, right? Who are servant-hearted, right? That are doing what they're doing in the common interest, of all the people. So by the time, as you know, Socrates was arrested and eventually executed for nefarious reasons. I mean, not nefarious on his end, but on his persecutors, right? By a corrupt regime, basically. And by the time of his death, Athens had lost a war against the Spartans. They had fallen into tyranny, multiple times, during that war. And so in the minds of the founders, democracy is a negative. And there's a word, ochlocracy, that we still use today, which means mob rule. That's how the founders and the ancient philosophers, many of them, viewed democracy, mob rule. So the sort of the flip side of that, if you look at Plato and Aristotle, they would say there is a place for a democratic element. They called it, though, polity. So that's where we get the word politics from. Right. So meaning the people. So a larger body of citizens can participate and have a say in one way, but it's balanced by the aristocratic element and the monarchical element, right? So that's where you get those sort of separation of powers and checks and balances. Yeah.
Okay, and we're going to come back to this idea, which is largely his interest in chapter 6. And if you're listening to this and you're enjoying the conversation, know that we're not bound to the chapter structure of this book. There's a lot of good things in here, but it does follow a certain order. And so as you're thinking about the structure of government, a structure of our public interaction with one another, we've got to look at the concepts, the principles behind it. And you have already mentioned the three key ones that Russell Kirk mentions, and it's justice, order, and freedom. And I thought we'd start there. And of course, justice goes back to the Greek idea of each his own. And it's primarily thinking about property and dignity. That there are certain things that you need in order to live your life, and those things need to be secured, and they need to be secured for a reason. Those things we think of as property, that you have the right to those things because they help you live your life, right? And they should be protected because you have dignity in the eyes of God. We're all created in the image of God, and that's where our dignity starts. Now, you could do things to damage your reputation or your credibility with other people, but even the worst criminal is a human being, and ought to be treated with that in mind. You think of the two criminals on the crosses next to Christ, and and the Lord's treating them with dignity even in their condemnation, right. Because that's all of us, right? So. But we have these three concepts: justice, order, and freedom. And you already mentioned that order without justice and freedom is tyranny, and freedom without, and this is the corollary goes with this, freedom without justice and order is anarchy. And of course, we can talk about that word a little bit. But how do we understand these ideas, and how do the founders take these ideas of justice, order, and freedom and make them practical? Because it's just not ideas that they wanted to talk about, but they actually wanted to live them out. Yes. In their lives.
It might be helpful to talk about each of these words in turn. So if we start with justice, you already mentioned, one rendering of that word, which is to each his own, coming out of a famous Latin phrase, but which means ultimately something like, okay, as a citizen in particular, you live in a city-state, you live in a republic. There are certain rights afforded to you. You have your property, you have your estate, and this is where another Greek word comes in, economics, right? Economia, which is the Greek word from where we get economics, means household management. In other words, you, as the head of the property of the family, have a right to deal with your daily affairs as you see fit. Like you should be left alone to do that. So to each his own, like in that sense. But then there's the other element of justice, which is related to another famous phrase, render to each his due. And so we really have to think about both of those things when we think about justice. In other words, and by the way, this understanding of justice will change over time, because when you're thinking about pre-Christian Greece and Rome and the philosophies that they had, the religious philosophies, let's say, that held in what they understood people to be, versus, say, the Jewish or Christian understanding about being created in the image and likeness of God, justice, takes a different shape. But rendering to each his due means that everybody is afforded, a certain level of dignity, certainly certain rights, under the law. But then within a society that's hierarchical, you're also going to have different gradations of like what each person is due. Like, so a king or a queen, for instance, would be due a certain level of respect and honor that,
Mm-hmm.
an everyday person wouldn't in a certain society, right? But even in our society today, like a parent has a certain level of authority in the hierarchical structure of the family that a child doesn't, right? And so there are some differences there. But if you keep those two things in mind, to each his own, and rendering to each person his due, his or her due, then you get the sense that, okay, we ought to have a kind of a common body of laws that govern us, and when things go wrong, there's a path to establishing justice. Or when somebody is wronged, like that person can be remunerated or cleared of something, et cetera. So we have to have that that kind of baseline, right? If we're going to have order in society. Imagine, if we didn't have a concept of justice that was somewhat universal, how could we have order? We'd be fighting over things all the time because of our disagreement. We'd have a lack of harmony.
Well, and I think that's kind of built into that related expression that freedom without justice and order is anarchy, and in the anarchy understood in the sense of chaos.
Yes.
I think that it's important too to say that justice infers a certain responsibility as well, because when and maybe that responsibility is on the part of the society, or maybe it's on the part of individuals. But when we don't live up to whether it's the laws or the mores of a society that everyone has agreed are necessary, then some of that justice is negative as well. Their consequences must be meted out. Somebody was complaining recently that politicians never face a consequence for lying. They lie all the time, but they don't. And it's not just politicians, but they're in that role where they make promises, and sometimes they are trying to steer agendas in certain directions, and they lie.
Yes.
But there aren't consequences for it, and that's unjust.
Right. Yeah, and I think universally people recognize that's unjust. The problem is we live in an imperfect society, and there are injustices that happen, unfortunately. But as our preamble in the Constitution says, that we're working toward a more perfect union, as best as we can get it, in this life. And we uphold the standard of justice by depicting justice, like the ancients did, as a figure holding a balance, right? So that there is, rather than just fairness, there's justice, right?
So in the chapter 5, he makes this point that American politics are not abstract, and and again, like we said at the beginning, they're not trying to create utopia. They're trying to create a practical environment, and he raises the French Revolution as a counterexample. Now that didn't occur until after the American Revolution. So as the American founders are thinking through these moral and political and economic principles, they may be looking at other countries in Europe, and they're probably looking back to the English Civil War and the establishment of the English Bill of Rights in the end of the 17th century, but they haven't seen the breakdown of French society yet. Although it's coming fast in this context, but Russell Kirk still makes a comparison between the two, and he says you can see there's some very distinct differences between a group of people that are committed to maintaining principles, and I think we can say that the American revolutionaries, in my view, sort of like the reformers during the Reformation period, weren't trying to tear anything down. They were trying to improve upon what they already had, or sustain what they thought was right based on their Christian heritage. But was that what was going on in France? And that's the question. So they get to see pretty soon after establishing the American states a different way.
Right.
What's your understanding of sort of the distinctions between the two situations?
Well, Kirk gives us a nice set of contrasting phrases, right? So for the American Republic, he uses the three words justice, order, and freedom as being the hallmarks, right? whereas in France, the expression was liberté, égalité, fraternité. So freedom, equality, and fraternity or brotherhood, right?
Mhm.
So notice, there's no order in there,
Mhm.
and in that one, and then notice how in the American triad there is no equality listed. It's not that equality, was not emphasized by the founders, but it was equality under the law.
Right.
Not certainly not that human beings are all equal by nature or by ability and so on, right? But in the French understanding, which was definitely more, radical and say not communitarian, but well, certainly more utopian. There were some among those those thinkers in France that truly believed that every human being was equal in the sense that we all have an equal nature, we all have equal abilities, and ought to be given the same opportunities. But so what happened in France is you didn't have the second of the American principles there, which is order, and then things deteriorated rather quickly. So we know that there was a reign of terror, lots of innocent people were killed, and then the ones that were persecuting others themselves were persecuted by their allies, and eventually they were all extinguished, right? So that's the problem. If you don't have justice, if you don't have order, as the key principles, as you mentioned, at the outset, you're looking, for a tyranny. This is the problem.
Yeah. Well, and I think a case could be made, and and I don't necessarily have any evidence for this, but I'm thinking about the reign of terror and what was happening there, which was basically a purge of the aristocratic class. Which, okay, maybe that group of people had made decisions that benefited them. Maybe they were corrupt. Maybe they weren't considering the people. Maybe all that is true. But when I hear you describe an emphasis on equality, it sounds to me, especially looking at the Reign of Terror, that it was an excuse, and it was an excuse to tear people down who maybe set themselves apart or above everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that's true or not, but certainly what happened. And you're right. And they had a system of justice, and it was we have decided what your crime is, and we're going to bring you before the magistrate or whatever the name was that they used for that judge, and the judge would pronounce their guilt, and off they'd go to the guillotine.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say it in the English way. My wife and I were talking about the habit of English speakers to not pronounce French words in the French way. So we'll call it the guillotine. But they just dragged them off and executed, beheaded hundreds, if not thousands, of people just because they were in a certain class.
Right.
And so I don't know. There's a cynical part of me that thinks if you, or maybe it's not cynical but informed, but if you don't really believe in the principles, if they're just slogans,
right,
then anything is permissible within that framework. You can justify anything you're doing. It's interesting that they put brotherhood in there.
Yes.
What did that really mean to them?
Right.
And was it a way for them to say, you all over there aren't our brothers, and so off with your heads?
Well, that when I think of that phrase, I think of a bunch of guys getting together in a tavern, drinking some ale, and brotherhood, freedom,
Clink.
Equality.
Right.
I mean, it all sounds wonderful.
Right.
Right.
But it sounds like slogans. It sounds like they've got another agenda.
Yeah. Well, so let's just say, let's give them the benefit of the doubt, some of the revolutionaries there, and say they had some good intentions, right? Because there was corruption, there was tyranny with the monarchy and the aristocrats and so on. But as the famous phrase goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't have the safeguards in place in your community, in your larger society, within the government to check you now, the revolutionaries who have come into power, what's going to happen? Well, just like with many people who have positions of authority, they become corrupt. They become my family and I just watched the Lord of the Rings films for the second time in however many years, and everybody there, as virtuous as they may be, is taken in by the power of the ring, right?
Mhm.
They cannot guard against it, right? And that's sort of how it is with power, right? I mean, there are very few people in history that have shown themselves able to withstand the allure of power, and they go down a dark road. And that's certainly what happened with the French revolutionaries. Again, no matter their original intentions. Now, here's the interesting thing. When Thomas Jefferson was in George Washington's cabinet, and you had Alexander Hamilton there and the others, Hamilton and Jefferson had some differences of philosophy over a variety of issues, one of which was supporting the French Revolution or not. Hamilton was opposed. He sided more with with the British model. Jefferson supported France. Now, he didn't support the violence that would come. He didn't support the radical elements, right? But there was something there initially that he had a kinship with, because those guys in France and the founders and the people in Great Britain, they were all reading the same ancients and the same modern philosophers, right? So they had these ideas of liberty were in the air, but they obviously went in a very different direction in France.
Yeah. So then what's the difference? What's the difference between what was established by the founders and clearly, because then we got the rise of Napoleon, the strong man
has to come in,
that has to come in and clean things up, kind of like what we've seen in El Salvador in modern times. But what's the difference here?
Well,
what's the lesson?
So we're gonna cutting into 2 chapters here now. Going back to culture, think about how our nation was established, like what it was rooted in here. Besides the Greco-Roman principles, besides the Judeo-Christian, moral principles and so on, you had a history here. When the colonists came over from Britain, and let's just take the 13 colonies for instance, they were very autonomous. In the work here, Russell Kirk talks about this principle called salutary neglect. In other words, the colonists, for the most part, were left alone by Britain. They had their own assemblies, they had their own governors, right? Of course, they're ultimately accountable to the Parliament and to the King, Great Britain, but because of the distance, in part, they had a lot of self-governance, and so they built up their own practices, their own institutions. They very much valued, the rights of Englishmen. They saw themselves as English, but they were independent. And so you think about a place like Massachusetts, with a lot of cities and towns compared to some of the other colonies. They had very burgeoning and active town halls, meetings, a lot of citizen participation. And, if you have that kind of society where people cherish freedoms, when they already cherish order, they have a good structure based on the British system, like they're more ripe for what the founders come to do after the American Revolution. And frankly, the colonies by the late 1700s had just experienced what's called the Second Great Awakening. So there was a great religious fervor, which, again, going back to a previous conversation, all of the founding fathers that write about the things that are necessary for a free republic to be maintained is religion and morality, right? So we had a lot of that was in the air, in the late 18th century. Whereas not that there were no faithful people in France, right? But it was just a different time, a different culture. And I would say, especially among the elites, you had more Enlightenment figures in France that were sort of on the deist and even agnostic side, some even atheist, than in the American colonies. And so, not that you can't have, sort of well-behaved and good agnostics and atheists, but what I'm suggesting there is, going back to the argument that Kirk makes earlier, is that those religious principles, those fundamentals, are guiding people into how they behave.
Right.
And order is part and parcel of that, and respect for valid government, valid authority, just government.
I think that's a point that John Adams makes when he says that our system of government is designed for religious people.
Yes.
And that's a paraphrase, but he's speaking to what you just described, that there's a self-governance that comes from a moral people, that and of course then there's also the saying, there'd be no need for government if men were angels.
Yeah.
So we know there needs to be some restraint, but that's certainly one of the virtues of well-practiced religion is that there are moral expectations,
Right.
and as long as people are taking those seriously,
Yes.
then the society tends to hold together. And I guess you could do a study on that sort of mindset in France and see if it existed there.
Yes. Well, I think one example is that, when the revolutionaries took over, what did they try to do? They tried to eliminate completely the Catholic Church and the Christian faith in general, and really establish a new state religion, just from scratch. Even creating a new calendar, creating new holidays, et cetera, which, think about it, is very radical.
Yes.
Right. Sort of like what Marxist communist dictators in the 20th century tried to do. Pol Pot, for instance, says today is day zero. In other words, a new beginning, fresh, and I'm going to tell you what it is.
We're unburdened by what has been.
Yes, that's crazy. That's radical, very radical.
Right. Well, that also, I think, gets to the second chapter in this part about number one, what does this state exist to do, and then if you can answer that question, how do you structure the state to do it? And I think we understand from the Constitution that the state is there to preserve our liberties. And that's almost it. Protect our national interests, make sure to provide for the common defense. But in the eyes of the founders, those are very limited things.
Right.
That were to be, and hence the 10th Amendment. So if the state exists to protect individual rights, what is the best way to organize a state is the question that the founders were dealing with. And what in your view, what answer did they come up with?
Yes.
Maybe it's not your view, but
right.
You're reading of history.
Yes. Well, what they came up with was what they had in large part. Had very active local and state, what would at that time it was the colonies, but local and state governments with a larger, what we'd call a central government, where power was shared between them, and all of it was limited, right? Eventually, a Bill of Rights, of course, is added to the Constitution besides the limits that are in the main body of the Constitution. But all of that is not really new. Now, combining them into one system is new. The federal system that we have is, can be attributed to, Madison really, but they were already used to that. So they had the rights of Englishmen. They had their House of Burgesses, their governors, et cetera, in their different colonies. And then, they had the experience for hundreds of years in Great Britain, which, okay, so compared to what the founders created, wasn't as free, let's say, but it was the freest in the world. It was the best, I would argue, the best system of government in the world at the time. But then they also had the ability, again, to look back to ancient Greece and Rome and everything in between. So the founding fathers were great students of history. When James Madison came to the Constitutional Convention, he brought stacks of books with him, going back all the way to ancient Rome, including like Justinian's Code, and all kinds of other documents, right? So these were, well-educated, studied people, and again, they were looking to the past to take the best of what had been done, to put something together for a brand new land. And so I think that's the key thing. Now, one emphasis in Chapter 6 is on what is called territorial democracy. Mm-hmm. Some people might call that, or maybe it's related to the concept of subsidiarity. Mm-hmm. The idea that, and this again goes back to our history, that people that live in a local area ought to be responsible for the things that impact them on a daily basis. Right. So the people that serve in Washington, D.C. should not be passing laws and making decisions about everyday life in Lewisville, Texas, right? There's a local government, there's a local community that has the most to gain and lose from the decisions that we make here, right? And so you have people often just think of a federal government in Washington, D.C. and then their state capital, but we have more than that, right? We have county government, we have city government or a township, whatever it is. And of course, the most important root, we have the family government. We have the government in the home, which is the source, of all of those things. And so, this idea is central in the United States, and it's different from France or Great Britain, where you have what's called a unitary government. So we call ours federal, right? They have unitary governments where all the decisions are made from the country's capital. Everybody, from the mayor to the governor and everybody else, comes under the direct authority of the president or the prime minister. Right? That's a different model, than what we have here. So federalism is super important. And when you ask a lot of people what prevents tyranny in our system, they will often say, well, there's separation of powers into the three branches, and there are checks and balances, which is important, no doubt, between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. But you could argue that even more important than that is that, especially because of the 10th Amendment protecting this, the states have powers and authority that the federal government does not have. And then even again, within the states, there's certain things that county government, city government, et cetera, do that they don't do in the state capitals, right? That's a whole nother level of prevention of tyranny, right? That many countries don't have. And if you put all that together with the way that it takes our two, let's say in the legislature, our two houses there to pass laws, it's a very long, drawn out process. That's exactly what the founding fathers wanted. They didn't want a government that can make quick decisions about everything. They wanted deliberation, they wanted thoughtfulness, and they wanted multiple voices to contribute to that conversation. And some people might say, oh, it takes too long to get these laws passed. Well, in some instances, yeah, you want something done immediately, and there are provisions for emergencies, to be sure. But trust me, and the founding fathers were totally right about this, you want things to take a long time. Otherwise, people that have a majority will just push their agenda in very quickly, good or bad.
Yeah, that's one of the key points there, because at the end of the day, the passing of a law is still a form of soft tyranny. It's still a majority saying that everyone, including those who disagree, are going to comply, and at least by having it be a long process, everyone gets a chance to express their voice and come to see the pros and cons of a certain thing, which I think is so. I will say that and I wrote about this recently for our annual report, that when Russell Kirk wrote this book in the 50s, we'd won World War II. The economic system seemed to be heading for a broad free market, which he would appreciate. There was still a sense of God's role in society, and he's very optimistic. We look now, and there could be reason for more pessimism, largely because instead of this proper legislative process that takes a lot of time, we see that a lot of the responsibilities for creating rules or laws has been abdicated to a professional bureaucracy, because the experts know better. Which just look at the EPA and the ridiculous decisions that are made in states across the country. Clearly, if they are experts, then I think we could question what area their expertise really is. But there's also this issue of executive order. And I think that's become a real problem, where the president can just sign an executive order, which is effectively just writing something into law.
Yes.
And I know that's one of the powers that the president has, but it was respected more in the past. You don't use executive orders. You let the legislature do its thing, and you let local towns and counties and states make their own decisions.
Right. Well, the executive orders constitutionally are only supposed to apply to domains within the executive branch's concerns, right? But once you get all of the agencies that you talked about, what some people today call like the fourth branch of our government, which is not a constitutional branch,
right.
that came about as a result of the progressives in the earlier 20th century. Now you have a president who's over those agencies because he's appointing all of those people that are heading them, and he could write an executive order related to the EPA or something else. So now his authority extends beyond the constitutional provisions for the executive, right? So yeah, we've definitely gone astray, in that area.
So it raises the question. I'm just going to bring this into the current era. A lot of the concern we heard in this election cycle is that if Donald Trump became president, he was going to become a dictator.
Yeah.
And of course, I wonder if that's a real concern. I don't necessarily look at Trump in particular and say, oh, he's going to become a dictator.
Mhm.
Because if you look at this subject of the use of the executive order, it's been escalating with every president. So you look at the number of executive orders President Obama signed, it was substantially greater than his predecessors,
Mhm.
and probably the same with President Biden in his turn. So I worry that this federal republic, where it's a collection of states coming together to make decisions on some common action, has given way to a power at the top
Mhm.
kind of scenario. And so when I look at what Russell Kirk is saying with his air of optimism, from looking at it 50, 60 years later,
Mhm.
70 years later, I wonder if he didn't anticipate some of the problems that
Right.
would come up.
Well, when he initially wrote this book, we didn't have all the government bureaucracy and agencies that we have today. Those
Yeah.
came about starting in the 60s and 70s
Right.
for the most part, right? So yeah, maybe he couldn't foresee that, at the time. But, going back to just the general question of tyranny, look, yeah, we could certainly have a president that could push the limits, and we've had presidents that have pushed different limits in the past couple of 100 years. And you would expect that with human beings. Like you hope that the person that's selected
Mhm.
president is both well qualified in terms of leadership abilities, but is also a person of strong character. But they're human beings that are selected, and that's why the legislative branch has to be strong. That's why we have a judicial branch, but that's also why we have state governments, and we need strong governors and state legislatures. So just to give you two examples of how there has been recent pushback from the states against what some people consider federal government overreach. One of them certainly is not universally accepted by people, but if you just think about the federal government's laws about the use of marijuana,
Mhm.
right? It's illegal, and yet we have states that have legalized it. So the states have pretty much said to the federal government, we don't care what you say. Here's what we've done, right? But in more recent times with COVID, there were pronouncements that came out of the federal government, out of the Office of the Presidency and different agencies, and states began to push back. They used judicial means, right? They took the federal government to court. Some of them just, created their own practices and policies, ignoring, what Health and Human Services and all the rest were saying. And so this is how it ought to be. And I'm not suggesting in either case that the state governments always did the right thing in those two instances. What I'm saying is those are just examples of how power can be checked at the state level, and it ought to be, because we're human. We're prone to disorder. We're prone to error, and for those that have power, they have an extra temptation in front of them that is very powerful.
Well, and I think we can be encouraged by the fact that the states do challenge the federal government.
Yeah.
I think Governor Abbott, who's been to our school, made the remark at one point that when he was Attorney General, the favorite part of his job was getting up every day and getting to sue the federal government.
Yes.
Which that's a political statement as well as a personal one for him.
Mm-hmm.
But the sentiment, I think, is correct. I think that the idea is that the states ought to be challenging the federal government, and hopefully, something can be done about all these agencies that are. And the Supreme Court actually did take a step in limiting what they
Yes.
can do
Yes.
over the summer. So I'm grateful for that. Let's in the couple minutes we have left, let's bring this down to the level of our schools. What do these ideas mean to the Founders Program?
Right. Well, I would argue that just thinking about subsidiarity, the school is a microcosm of the larger community, and so there's the type of governance that happens there. We're obviously helping families to form young men and women that will hopefully be virtuous people and good citizens.
Right.
So they certainly need to understand these principles that we've been describing here, and of course more than what we've been discussing here, because they will be part of the group of adults that help to make this country flourish, hopefully to improve in the future, but if need be, to serve as bulwarks against tyranny. Right? Each and every person has an obligation to stand up for the principles that we in which we believe, for the principles that are outlined in the Constitution. And when government oversteps, whether it's at the national or the local level, each person, is sort of naturally recruited to be in that force that pushes against it.
I think too that our to that point, our students, when they become adults, will naturally question, what these various political bodies are doing, and asking, is this being done in the best interest of the people, and is this something that we need? And they'll have the background to understand what's happening and to weigh those actions against principles,
Yes.
which we want them to do.
Well, we can draw a parallel to the conditions that prompted the writing of this book by Russell Kirk, right? If you recall from our first conversation, we talked about how he was asked to write this book because we had a good number of prisoners of war, first in Korea and then later in Vietnam, who were being convinced while they were in prison there of the merits of Marxism, right? And the question was, how could that possibly be? How could an American raised in this country, educated here, go in that direction, right? And so this primer, was written, and I think we're kind of in a similar place now. And I can't say that the condition of people's civic education is better or worse than it was in the 1950s. I suspect worse in some ways, but we have a large percentage of young people and adults that don't know the fundamental principles that we've been talking about here, and therefore wouldn't necessarily think to rise up. Well, first of all, they wouldn't necessarily recognize when something's gone terribly wrong, right? And they're not equipped to even detect truth from fiction. Think about, in the current elections, how, the numbers of fallacies that are thrown about with political ads and debates, and all the rest. If you're not well educated, you could very easily be deceived, especially when you tune in at the last minute. And, just to come back to tyranny and Donald Trump, no matter what you believe about him, I think it's not only offensive, certainly to people that have been under tyranny, but ludicrous to refer to him as a Nazi, right? To refer to him as a fascist, right? If you know what Nazism was, and Nazism was fascism, then you would never make a statement like that about somebody running for office in this country. Whether you like him or not is beside the point. Whether you agree with his policies or not, that's beside the point, right? But if you're well educated and a person of conviction, you're not going to refer to our political candidates that way.
Right. Well, I think the other part of the problem is something we're going to get into in the third conversation, which is economic, the principles behind our commercial interactions with one another and our own gathering of our personal wealth and property, which we have a right to. There are interesting aspects of our economic system that didn't exist, or no, they in the 50s they didn't exist. And I'm thinking particularly about the way our money is created and how it's backed, and we can get into that as well. But we have a large percentage of our students go to college and believe that socialism is the way, and some of that, in my view, is understandable because they look at an economic system which, if you listen to Ron Paul at all, will tell you it's broken and steals from the people and creates a situation in which the government gets all the money and the people close to the government get all the money and the people have no hope. And when you have no hope, you get it in your mind that, well, it's not, necessarily breaking up a society or a financial system that does it, but it's capturing the government, and then the government can take care of all the problems. Well, we're going to talk about that a little bit and in our next conversation. And if it goes the way Ron Paul would want it to go, he would say government is the problem. They're not the solution to the problem.
Yes.
The people are the solution to the problem, and taking responsibility based on an understanding of these principles for their own lives is what's going to help us. Although, as he will also say, the problems are very big.
Yes.
And so that's going to be an interesting conversation, the dealing with the economic principles. There's a lot to this book, and I feel like we just scratched the surface.
Yes.
I think you do a great job of bringing out some of the stories that are behind it, both from ancient history and also from the founding era. So this has been an interesting conversation. Again, I strongly encourage you to pick up a copy from Amazon of Russell Kirk's The American Cause. It's an excellent book. We're both enjoying reading it. We go through it multiple times, and every time I know I learn some more nuance to it. And this is just the primer.
Yes. Yeah, and it's very readable. Very readable. I mean, anybody can pick up this book, read a chapter or section at a time, and it's very digestible.
Yeah, and I encourage people to take a look at that. Okay, so next time it's economics. We've covered moral and political, and there's a little more to come in this 3-part series. So
Yes.
Hopefully people will enjoy all 3 segments of it and learn something the way I am as we're going through it.
All right, look forward to it.
Okay, great.